Hey guys, what sounds at first like a simple matter of getting dressed in the Middle Ages turns out to have been something far more physical, far more constant, and in many ways far more uncomfortable than modern people usually imagine. Medieval clothing was not just a style or a statement. It was a daily environment, worn from morning until night, shaped by cold, sweat, status, labor, modesty, cost, and the stubborn limits of the materials people actually had. So before we settle in, tell me where you're watching from, and let me know what history topic you'd like to hear next. And if you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a quiet like is a simple way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, interesting stories from the past, consider subscribing to understand what wearing medieval clothes all day actually felt like. It helps to set aside the polished paintings, the bright costumes of modern film, and the tidy museum displays. Clothing in medieval Europe was rarely experienced as an isolated object. It was felt as weight, friction, heat, dampness, pressure, and routine. It shaped how people moved, worked, rested, and appeared to one another. And what it felt like depended not only on wealth, but on weather, region, occupation, and the slow practical logic of a world in which cloth itself was expensive, labor-intensive, and deeply valuable. For many people, the first sensation of clothing began not with softness, but with texture. Linen worn close to the skin could be relatively comfortable, especially when clean and well-made, and for those who could afford enough of it, linen underclothes did a great deal of quiet work. They absorbed sweat, protected outer garments from body oils, and could be washed more often than heavier layers. But that comfort had limits. Linen could stiffen when poorly laundered or dried badly, and not everyone owned enough of it to keep a fresh rotation. Wool, meanwhile, dominated much of everyday dress in medieval Europe, and wool could range from fine and surprisingly pleasant to coarse, heavy, and scratchy. Much depended on quality. A wealthy merchant or noble might wear well-processed wool that draped with some grace. A peasant or laborer was more likely to know the rougher side of the fabric, the kind that kept out cold and weather but never quite let you forget you were wearing it. That may be the first important correction to the modern imagination. Medieval clothing was not necessarily miserable all the time. It was often practical, and practicality can feel reassuring. But practical did not mean light, flexible, or invisible. Clothing was something you noticed, pressed itself into daily awareness. A tunic might pull across the shoulders during work. Hose might bind or loosen depending on how they were tied and how much the fabric had stretched. A belt was not simply decorative. It held the structure of the outfit together, supported pouches, knives, keys, and other necessary objects, and changed how weight sat on the body over the course of a day. And the body mattered enormously. Medieval clothes were not standardized in the modern industrial sense. Fit depended on tailoring, household skill, inherited garments, and alteration. Better fit could make clothing feel orderly and secure. Poor fit could make it feel like a constant negotiation. A sleeve slightly too narrow would not merely look awkward. It would rub. A garment cut without enough ease might resist bending, lifting, or climbing. An item handed down from someone broader, taller, or differently built might hang, twist, or bunch in inconvenient ways. Wearing clothes all day meant living inside these small imperfections for hours. The experience also changed with class, though not always in the most obvious way. Wealthier people generally had access to better cloth, finer linen, fur linings, richer dyes, more layers, and more tailored garments. In one sense, that meant more comfort. In another sense, it often meant more complexity. Elite clothing could be heavy with meaning as much as with material. A noblewoman's gown might include fitted sleeves, pins, laces, veils, belts, and layered fabrics that created elegance at the cost of ease. A wealthy man's garments might signal dignity and rank but still involve long robes, close sleeves, and carefully arranged layers that were not designed for casual physical freedom. Clothing at the upper end of society was not merely worn. It was managed. For working people, by contrast, simplicity could bring a certain functional relief, but that did not mean bodily comfort. A laborer's tunic, hose, cloak, and simple shoes might allow more practical movement than courtly dress. Yet those clothes still had to endure mud, rain, animal smells, smoke, and repetitive strain. The same garment might be worn through fieldwork, domestic labor, travel, and sleep. Fabric would grow damp, then dry stiff, then soften again with use. Seams would pull. Dirt would settle in hems. If the weather turned, clothing could become heavy enough to feel almost like equipment rather than dress. And weather, in truth, may have been one of the greatest forces shaping how medieval clothing felt. In cold seasons, layers were not optional comforts. They were defenses. A shirt, a tunic, perhaps an additional gown or outer layer, then a cloak, hood, or mantle. Wool held warmth even when conditions were poor, which made it invaluable, but warmth came with bulk. The body was wrapped not for sleekness but for endurance. Sitting in a stone building with drafts slipping under doors and through shutters, a person would not think of clothing as an expression of self in the modern sense. They would feel it as a barrier between flesh and a difficult world. Even indoors, sleeves and cloaks were part of surviving the day. Yet cold did not simply make clothing useful. It made it complicated. Thick layers could protect the body, but they could also restrict it. Hands vanished into folds. Wet hems stayed wet. Cloaks slipped, caught, and needed constant arranging. If a person had to work outdoors and then move indoors, garments warmed slowly, if at all. In badly heated spaces, dampness lingered. The sensation of wearing medieval clothes in winter was often not one of total warmth but of partial defense. Pockets of heat preserved within a larger atmosphere of chill. Summer brought a different problem. Heavy outer layers might be shed, but medieval Europe did not suddenly become a world of airy cotton and synthetic breathability. Linen helped, and looser clothing could improve comfort, but sweat, dust, and sun changed the experience entirely. Wool worn in warm conditions could become oppressive. Head coverings, necessary for modesty, habit, status, or simple protection, trapped heat. The body grew sticky. Fabric clung. Dirt mixed with perspiration. A long day of physical labor in such clothing would have been defined not by picturesque rustic charm, but by the slow fatigue of being wrapped in materials that were doing several jobs at once and none of them perfectly. One of the most underestimated aspects of medieval clothing is how much fastening mattered. Modern clothing often relies on buttons, elastic, zippers, stretch fabrics, and standardized sizing. Medieval dress relied far more on ties, laces, brooches, pins, belts, and skilled arrangement. That meant garments could be adjusted, which was useful, but it also meant they could loosen, shift, or need attention during the day. Hose might need readying. A cloak might need securing against wind. A veil or head covering might slip. Clothing was not always a sealed, passive shell. It was a system that required maintenance from the person inside it. Shoes deserve their own place in this story, because what one felt on the feet shaped the entire experience of the day. Medieval footwear varied enormously, and some shoes could be supple and practical, especially turn shoes made from soft leather. But they were not modern orthopedic miracles. Soles were thin by contemporary standards. In towns, streets could be filthy, uneven, and wet. In the countryside, ground could be rocky, muddy, frozen, or slick with straw and manure. A medieval shoe did not isolate the wearer from the world below nearly as thoroughly as a modern shoe does. You would feel terrain more directly. Cold rose through the sole. Moisture found its way in. And if the leather stiffened, cracked, or warped, every step reminded you. There is also the matter of smell, which polite reconstructions tend to soften. Clothing was expensive enough that even the relatively prosperous treated garments with care, repaired them, stored them, and reused them. But careful use did not erase the bodily reality of wearing cloth for long periods in a world full of smoke, animals, limited washing opportunities, and damp interiors. Garments collected the atmosphere around them. They held traces of hearth smoke, sweat, spilled ale, kitchen grease, wet weather, workshop dust, and the ordinary odors of crowded life. Freshness, in the modern sense, was difficult to maintain. Clothes were not necessarily filthy beyond recognition, but they were close companions of the body and its environment. This is where modern misunderstanding often becomes most obvious. People sometimes imagine medieval dress either as romantic costume or as universal discomfort, but the truth is more interesting. Medieval people were not foolishly tolerating unbearable clothes because they lacked imagination. They were dressing according to available materials, established habits, moral expectations, and very practical needs. Layering protected expensive outer garments. Head coverings served religious, social, and environmental functions. Wool, however imperfect, was durable and warm. Belts and ties were not clumsy relics. They were workable solutions in a material culture built on repair, reuse, and adjustment. And once we see that, another layer opens up. Clothing did not only feel like fabric on skin. It felt like social position made physical. A servant dressed one way because service required it. A widow, a cleric, a married woman, an apprentice, a merchant, a minor noble, each lived inside visible codes that were read by others almost instantly. What you wore shaped how you were treated, what was expected of you, and sometimes what risks you faced if you dressed above your station. Sumptuary laws in some places tried to regulate what certain people could wear, especially luxurious materials or status-coded adornments. So clothing all day did not only press on the shoulders or chafe at the neck. Pressed socially. It reminded the wearer and everyone nearby where they belonged or where they were trying to appear to belong. For women in particular, the physical experience of dress was often intertwined with ideals of modesty, order, and respectability. Layers, veils, fitted garments, aprons, girdles, and pinned arrangements could create dignity and social security, but they also limited spontaneity. Bending, lifting, walking quickly, or working around heat and dirt all had to be managed within clothing that carried moral meaning. Men, too, lived within strict dress expectations, especially as ideas of propriety and rank sharpened across regions and centuries. Clothing did not only cover the body, it disciplined it, and yet, within all this discipline, there was adaptation. Sleeves could be rolled. Cloaks could be hitched. Fine garments were changed for rough tasks when possible. People learned how to stand, sit, work, and travel in the clothes they owned. This may be one of the quietest but most revealing truths of medieval life. What sounds awkward to us often became second nature to them, not because the clothing ceased to be restrictive, but because the body learned its rules. Habit can make even a demanding material world feel normal. That normality, however, should not blind us to the strain. At the end of a long day, when shoes came off, belts loosened, and heavier layers were finally removed, the relief must often have been immediate and deeply physical. Marks on the body, tired shoulders, damp linen, chilled feet, and smoke-perfumed wool would all have told the story of the day more honestly than any illuminated manuscript ever could. And that story becomes even more revealing when we move from ordinary clothing into the more specific problems of sleepwear, undress, and what happened when the day finally ended but the body was still living inside the material limits of the medieval world. And that story becomes even more revealing when we move from ordinary clothing into the more specific problems of sleepwear, undress, and what happened when the day finally ended but the body was still living inside the material limits of the medieval world. For many medieval people, the transition from daytime clothing to nighttime comfort was not as dramatic as a modern listener might instinctively imagine. The idea of a completely separate private wardrobe for rest belonged more to wealth, space, and circumstance than to everyday reality. Some people certainly had garments intended for sleeping, especially simple linen shirts, but many others ended the day by loosening, removing, or partially rearranging what they already wore. In households where fabric was valuable, storage space was limited, and warmth mattered, clothing did not always divide neatly into modern categories. Dress for work, for social respectability, for modesty, and for sleep could overlap in practical ways. That overlap changed what it meant to feel physically at ease. If you had spent the day in hose tied at the waist, or in a belt holding the shape of your garments together, then any moment of undressing would have brought more than privacy. It would have brought release. The body, after hours of constraint, would begin to soften back into itself. But the degree of that relief depended on where you were, who else was present, what the temperature was, and whether you could afford to remove very much at all. In a cold room, with thin bedding and air moving through timber boards or stone walls, shedding layers could be less a pleasure than a calculation. This is another place where medieval clothing becomes more human and less theatrical. We often imagine undressing as a private act completed in comfort, under lamplight, in a room devoted to personal rest. But for most people, privacy was thin. A servant might sleep in a shared space. A family might sleep close together. Travelers might lie in inns where strangers occupied the same room, or even the same bed. Clothing at the end of the day, therefore, remained entangled with modesty, status, and necessity. To remove too much might mean discomfort from cold. To remove too little might mean carrying the burdens of the day deeper into the night. A linen shift or shirt, where available, mattered enormously here. It formed a soft intermediary world between the skin and the heavier realities of outer dress. That softness should not be overstated. Linen could wrinkle, bunch, and chill when the air was cold. But compared with wool, with belts, with layered fitted garments, it offered a more breathable and less restrictive way for the body to settle. In a sense, it allowed a person to step back from the public self-worn throughout the day. Beneath the outer garments of rank, labor, and propriety, there was this simpler layer, more intimate, more washable, and more closely tied to bodily comfort. Even so, the experience of rest remained deeply shaped by daytime clothing because medieval garments left traces behind. A body that had carried weight across the shoulders all day did not cease to feel that weight simply because a tunic was removed. Feet kept the memory of hard shoes and uneven roads. Skin held impressions from seams and ties. Hair, especially if covered much of the day, carried the dull fatigue of pins, veils, fillets, or caps. And if outer garments had gathered dampness, smoke, or grit, the act of removing them was not merely procedural. It was sensory. There would have been the smell of wool warming by the hearth, the slight heaviness of cloth not fully dry, the stiffened edge of a cuff, the accumulated dust shaken out before the night. For wealthier households, attendants and servants could make this process more controlled. Clothing might be brushed, aired, folded, or placed carefully for morning use. Better quality garments justified careful handling. Yet this very refinement reminds us that elite clothing often demanded more labor, not less. Rich fabrics, fitted sleeves, laced bodices, decorative fastenings, and layered gowns could make dressing and undressing slower, more dependent on other hands, and more structured by ritual. Comfort existed, but it existed inside a system of management. A noblewoman might remove costly outer garments and feel immediate bodily relief, Yet the day's dress had also affirmed her place in the world. Ease and obligation remained closely linked. Among poorer households, the line between clothing and bedding could become even less clear. Cloaks might serve as blankets. Hoods, mantles, or extra layers might be kept on in cold conditions. The body went to sleep not in a purpose-built cocoon of private comfort, but in a practical arrangement designed to conserve warmth. That meant the feeling of medieval clothing extended into the night. You did not always stop wearing the day simply because darkness had arrived. In winter especially, the body might sleep in negotiation with the same fabrics that had accompanied work, travel, or household labor only hours earlier. And then morning reversed the process. Clothing did not wait passively in a bright wardrobe, ready for the day. It was often cool to the touch. Leather might have stiffened overnight. Damp wool might not have fully dried. Laces had to be retied, belts tightened, layers settled back into place. To dress in a medieval household was frequently to resume a relationship with materials that had never entirely relaxed. There was no hidden machine laundering, no climate control, no elastic recovery of fabric, no deep reserve of identical replacements. Each garment returned with its own condition, its own wear, its own slight resistance. This helps explain something larger about the emotional texture of medieval dress. Clothing created continuity. A person was not constantly stepping into fresh, neutral surfaces. They returned again and again to familiar pieces marked by repeated use. A tunic's softened spot at the elbow, a repaired tear near the hem, a belt curved by long habit, a cloak whose fastening sat in precisely the same place every day. These things would have made dress deeply personal. Not luxurious necessarily, not always comfortable, but intimate. Clothing knew the body because it had been shaped by it over time. That intimacy became even more apparent in work. The sensation of wearing medieval clothing all day cannot be separated from what the body was asked to do while wearing it. A field worker bending repeatedly in a long tunic experienced clothing differently from a merchant seated indoors, a monk moving through regulated hours, or a townswoman carrying water, tending fires, preparing food, and managing children. The same wool, the same linen, the same leather footwear changed character under strain. Clothes that were manageable while standing still became restrictive during crouching, climbing, or lifting. Garments that seemed warm at dawn became oppressive by midday. A belt that sat comfortably at rest might dig inward under the pressure of constant movement. In this sense, medieval clothing was not a stable sensation but a changing one. It tightened as the day advanced. It warmed, loosened, dampened, stiffened, shifted. A person dressed in the early morning was not wearing exactly the same garment by late afternoon in the bodily sense. The cloth had taken on heat, moisture, and movement. This is easy to forget because surviving garments in museums appear silent and complete. But lived clothing was dynamic. It responded to labor and weather hour by hour. There is a particularly revealing contrast here between clothing made for durability and clothing made for display. Durable clothing often won the contest of daily life, even when it lost the contest of beauty. A strong wool garment might outlast finer cloth, shield against weather, and tolerate repair. It might also scratch, weigh down the body, and look plain. Decorative clothing, by contrast, could signal refinement and prestige while requiring careful movement and constant attention. The tension between appearance and physical ease was not incidental. It was one of the central truths of pre-modern dress. The more a garment proclaimed status, the more likely it was to ask something of the body in return. This was visible in sleeve design, for example, which changed across periods and social settings. Some sleeves were practical and narrow enough to keep from interfering with work. Others became long, decorative, or fashionably cut in ways that enhanced visual impression but complicated movement. The same could be said of fitted garments more broadly. Tailoring could create beauty and structure, but it could also localize pressure. The shoulder, underarm, chest, and waist became points where cloth governed posture. A body dressed fashionably could not always move casually. Headwear, too, deserves more attention than it usually gets. The medieval head was often covered, especially for women, but also for men depending on climate, occupation, and status. Hoods, coifs, veils, hats, caps, and wrappings each had their own physical presence. Some protected against cold and weather. Some contained the hair. Some signaled respectability. But to wear something on the head for long hours is to live with another layer of pressure and temperature. Heat gathered, hair flattened, skin at the forehead or around the ears might feel constant contact. Removal at the end of the day could have brought not only relief, but that peculiar lightness familiar to anyone who has worn restrictive headgear for too long. The same is true of women's hair arrangements beneath coverings. Braiding, pinning, binding, and managing long hair before it could be covered was a labor in itself. Hair was not simply left to fall naturally into place. It had to be ordered. That meant the bodily experience of dress began before the visible garments were even fully on. It also meant that appearance was built through patience, repetition, and bodily discipline. Clothing was only the outermost layer of a larger system of presentation. Yet it would be too simple to portray all this as oppression by fabric. Medieval people also used clothing to create dignity, protection, beauty, and belonging. A well-made garment could be a source of pride. A properly wrapped cloak could bring real comfort in bad weather. A sturdy pair of shoes, though primitive by modern standards, could still mean the difference between hardship and something closer to security. The body suffered certain inconveniences, certainly, but it also relied on dress as a form of material assurance. In a world less insulated from cold, dirt, and public scrutiny than our own, clothing gave structure to existence. That is why laundering mattered so much, even though it was difficult. It is a mistake to think people simply ignored bodily discomfort or garment care. They understood the value of cleanliness, airing, brushing, mending, and protecting fabric, even if their methods and possibilities differed from ours. Linen underlayers could be washed more often precisely because they protected the more costly and difficult-to-clean outer garments. This arrangement made sense economically, but it also tells us something about what clothing felt like. Medieval people knew very well that garments close to the skin absorbed the body's life. Sweat, oils, and dirt were part of the daily bargain. The underlayer was not merely tradition. It was technology of a sort, quiet, domestic, and essential. And once we recognize that, we begin to see medieval dress less as costume and more as infrastructure. It organized the body's relationship to climate, labor, modesty, and hierarchy. It reduced some discomforts while creating others. It made movement possible while also limiting it. It concealed the body while forcing the wearer to remain acutely aware of it. This is perhaps the deepest irony at the center of the subject. Clothing existed to regulate daily life so thoroughly that it often became invisible as a social fact, yet on the level of physical sensation it could remain stubbornly present from dawn until sleep. For children, the experience must have carried its own particular mix of adaptation and resistance. Children grew quickly, which meant garments were frequently handed down, altered, extended, or tolerated while slightly ill-fitting. The impatience modern children feel toward uncomfortable formal wear is probably not a bad guide here, except that medieval children lived much more of life in clothing shaped by economy rather than choice. The body grew, the garment lagged behind, and the resulting discomfort would have been absorbed into ordinary experience. Childhood itself was lived within cloth that expressed family means and household necessity. For older adults, meanwhile, the relationship with clothing may have changed again. Stiff joints, aching backs, reduced dexterity, and sensitivity to cold would all have altered what garments felt like and how manageable they were. Tying laces, bending to manage hose or shoes, carrying the weight of heavy outerwear, enduring drafty conditions in winter. These were not neutral tasks. They were shaped by age as much as by status. Medieval clothing, like medieval life more broadly, met the body where the body actually was, and the body was never the same across a lifetime. Travel sharpened every problem. What might feel manageable in a settled household became more difficult on the road. Clothes were exposed to rain, dust, mud, repeated wear, and the problem of drying. A cloak that served well as warmth could become burdensome when wet. Shoes broke down faster. Spare garments were limited. The traveler wore not only clothing but uncertainty. A day's weather could turn ordinary fabric into a source of persistent misery. And yet the same garments were also what stood between the traveler and far worse discomfort. Medieval dress was often inadequate by modern standards, but it was rarely arbitrary. It was a compromise between need and possibility. By the later Middle Ages, fashion in some places began to intensify these contradictions. More shaped garments, more visible tailoring, more changing silhouettes, more attention to how cloth presented the body. These developments did not erase practicality, but they did increase the tension between display and ease. Clothes could become more expressive, more socially pointed, and sometimes more physically demanding. The body was asked not simply to be covered or warmed, but to appear in particular ways. That shift did not happen all at once, and it varied by class and region, but it deepened the sense that clothing was both personal material and public language. And public language always has a cost. The body pays part of it. A hem cut for beauty may drag through dirt. A fitted sleeve may flatter the arm while narrowing its freedom. Fine shoes may announce standing while offering little forgiveness to the foot. A carefully arranged veil may create dignity while trapping heat and requiring constant correction. These are not modern complaints imposed on the past. They are the ordinary consequences of clothing being asked to do more than one thing at once. Perhaps that is the most honest answer to what wearing medieval clothes all day actually felt like. It felt different by hour, by season, by wealth, by gender, by labor, by age. Could feel secure, respectable, and warm. Could feel itchy, damp, heavy, and constraining. It could feel intimate through long use and impersonal through social obligation. It could help a person endure the world while also reminding them, every few minutes, of the world's roughness. And once we follow that tension closely enough, another question begins to rise quite naturally from it. Not simply how clothing felt when worn, but how people chose, valued, repaired, inherited, and even judged one another through garments that were never just personal possessions, but visible pieces of the medieval order itself. And once we follow that tension closely enough, another question begins to rise quite naturally from it. Not simply how clothing felt when worn, but how people chose, valued, repaired, inherited, and even judged one another through garments that were never just personal possessions, but visible pieces of the medieval order itself. In the modern world, clothing can be disposable. A shirt may be bought casually, worn for a season, and forgotten without much thought. In medieval Europe, for most people, cloth belonged to a completely different moral and economic universe. Fabric represented labor on a scale that is easy to underestimate. Wool had to be sheared, cleaned, carded, spun, woven, fulled, dyed, cut, and sewn. Linen required flax to be grown, harvested, rent, broken, combed, spun, and woven through an equally demanding chain of work. Even before a garment existed, countless hands and many hours already lived inside it. That reality changed how clothing felt emotionally. A cloak was not merely something to wear when cold. It was an investment of household wealth. A well-made gown might represent months of saving, family effort, or inherited security. Even a simple working tunic carried value because replacing it was not effortless. This is why repair was so central to medieval life. Clothes were patched, altered, turned inside out, recut for younger bodies, shortened, lengthened, and handed downward through households and generations. A tear in a sleeve was not a small inconvenience. It was a practical problem with economic consequences. To wear medieval clothes all day, then, was also to wear the memory of previous wearers. A child might wear a garment first made for an older sibling. A servant might receive altered cast-off clothing from a wealthier household. A widow might continue wearing garments tied not only to necessity but to memory, because cloth carried associations as well as warmth. In this way, clothing was almost never entirely new in the emotional sense. It arrived with history attached. This inheritance shaped identity. People knew what certain garments had cost, who had once worn them, and what they implied. A fine cloak did not simply signal warmth. It signaled means. Well-dyed fabric, especially in richer colors, could announce prosperity before a word was spoken. Bright dyes required expense and skill, and some colors carried especially strong social meanings. The poor were not dressed only in dull shades by universal rule, but access to vibrant, well-maintained cloth was uneven enough that appearance became a kind of visible accounting. This is where the social pressure of dress became sharper. Clothing was read constantly. In towns, in churches, in markets, and at household thresholds, people formed judgments through cloth before they knew anything else. Was the fabric clean? Was it repaired carefully or carelessly? Did the shoes suggest hardship or security? Was the wearer attempting to present above their station, or failing to maintain the dignity expected of their place? These judgments could be quiet, but they were powerful. Medieval moral writing often reflected this tension. Excessive luxury could be condemned as vanity, pride, or moral disorder. Yet visible neglect could also invite suspicion or shame. Respectability lived in a narrow corridor between ostentation and failure. A merchant needed to look established but not morally extravagant. A widow needed to reflect seriousness and propriety. A cleric's dress carried expectations of discipline. A noble had obligations of visible status. Even humility had visual rules. This meant that clothing could become a source of anxiety not because people were unusually superficial, but because garments communicated trustworthiness. If your clothes looked wrong, people might not simply think you had bad taste. They might think you were dishonest, unstable, unserious, or socially dangerous. Dress helped stabilize a world where formal paperwork, modern credentials, and anonymous urban life were far less developed. Clothing acted partly as social evidence. And because of that, laws sometimes tried to control it. Sumptuary laws, rules regulating what certain classes could wear, appear repeatedly across medieval and early modern Europe. Not everyone obeyed them, and enforcement varied widely, but their existence reveals a deep concern. Authorities worried that dress could blur hierarchy. If merchants dressed too richly, if prosperous townspeople adopted noble signals, if servants appeared above expectation, then visual order itself became unstable. These laws were often less about cloth than about power. Silk, fur, embroidery, certain colors, certain cuts, these were not merely aesthetic choices. They were markers of belonging. Restricting them helped preserve a social map that elites wanted to remain legible. Clothing was expected to tell the truth about rank, or at least the approved version of it. But human beings rarely obey visible boundaries without negotiation. People borrowed prestige where they could. They trimmed garments to suggest refinement. They chose better belts, better hats, or better shoes when a full transformation was impossible. Small details mattered because they allowed aspiration to hide inside practicality. A hood of slightly finer cloth, a carefully maintained pair of leather shoes, a cleaner and better-cut tunic. These could alter how one moved through the world. That aspiration tells us something important. Medieval people were not passive inhabitants of rigid costume. They used clothing actively, strategically, and emotionally. Dress could be protective, ambitious, proud, anxious, comforting, and deeply personal all at once. A servant might treasure a single good garment reserved for feast days. A craftsman might invest carefully in clothing that made clients trust his reliability. A young person approaching marriageable age might feel the social stakes of appearance with extraordinary intensity. Feast days themselves changed the bodily experience of dress. Clothing worn for ordinary labor was one thing. Clothing worn for religious festivals, weddings, public celebrations, or courtly occasions was another. These moments often demanded garments that were less practical and more symbolic. Better fabric emerged from storage. Shoes meant for display rather than muddy roads appeared. Headwear became more elaborate. Belts, brooches, and accessories carried greater importance. And with that came a familiar human contradiction. The clothes that made one feel most visible were not always the clothes that felt best to wear. Anyone who has stood too long in formal shoes or adjusted uncomfortable clothing during an important event will understand this instantly. Medieval people knew the same negotiation. A feast day gown could inspire pride while limiting movement. A carefully dressed appearance at church might feel socially necessary while physically inconvenient. Ceremony often required the body to accept a certain amount of discomfort in exchange for dignity. Marriage provides one of the clearest examples. Bridal clothing was not simply romantic decoration. It was public symbolism, family economics, and social presentation woven together. Garments might be borrowed, remade, specially prepared, or carefully displayed because marriage itself was not only private affection but public transition. What one wore mattered because it helped declare legitimacy, family standing, and seriousness of intent. The same principle extended into mourning. Clothing marked grief visibly. Darker or more restrained garments, depending on region and period, could become part of how sorrow was socially recognized. Here again, dress was not just personal preference. It was a language through which emotional life became legible to others. Even religious devotion had a texture of clothing. Pilgrims, monks, nuns, priests, and lay worshippers all encountered dress as moral practice. A rough habit could symbolize discipline and renunciation. Simplicity of dress could be admired as sincerity, though sometimes it also became a performance of humility. Pilgrimage clothing had to balance symbolic identity with brutal practicality. A traveler walking long distances to a shrine cared very much how shoes held up, how cloaks managed rain, and how garments survived repeated use. There is a revealing irony here. The more spiritual the purpose, the more stubbornly physical the clothing often became. A monk's robe still scratched, a pilgrim's boots still blistered. Holiness did not remove the body from cloth. It simply gave the discomfort different meaning. Children learned these meanings early. They were taught not only how to wear clothing, but how to behave inside it, how to sit properly, how to keep garments from unnecessary damage, how to present oneself before elders, clergy, or employers. Clothing was part of moral education because self-control could be seen. Disorder in dress implied disorder in character. This is especially visible in the care of aprons, belts, caps, and head coverings. Small things but socially loud things. A loose belt, dirty apron, or careless cap could suggest laziness or disrespect. Cleanliness and order were never only about hygiene. They were moral signals. Medieval households understood this intimately. and households, more than markets, were often where clothing's true life happened. Spinning, mending, washing, storing, airing, and sewing were woven into domestic routine. The visible garment outside began with invisible labor inside. Much of that labor fell to women, whether in noble households supervising textile production or in ordinary homes where clothing survival depended on steady maintenance. To ask what medieval clothes felt like is also to ask whose hands kept them wearable. Because clothing deteriorated constantly. Mud attacked hems. Fire singed sleeves. Work thinned elbows and knees. Rain damaged leather. Moths found stored wool. Lice and fleas created another layer of discomfort and maintenance that modern clean museum displays politely ignore. Garments were not static treasures preserved under perfect conditions. They were under siege from ordinary life. This made storage surprisingly important. Chests, hooks, folded linens, careful protection from damp. All of this shaped whether clothing lasted. A good cloak ruined by mold was not just an inconvenience. Could be a household setback. And so the physical experience of clothing included anticipation and worry. Before winter, one wondered whether the outer layers would hold. Before travel, one calculated what could be spared. Even theft reveals value. Clothing theft was common enough in many places to remind us how desirable garments were. A cloak, a belt, a pair of shoes, a decent hood, these were portable forms of wealth. To steal them was practical, not trivial. A missing garment could threaten both comfort and social standing. Second-hand markets also flourished because cloth moved through society in long lives. Old garments were sold, repurposed, inherited, or broken down into other uses. Clothing circulated like material memory. A noble's discarded garment might, through stages of alteration, eventually become something entirely different in another household far below. This circulation complicates the romantic image of medieval fashion. The bright noble gown and the rough peasant tunic were not always separate worlds. They could be connected through time, through resale, through cutting and recutting. A sleeve from one life might become lining in another. And this practical intimacy with cloth meant people understood textiles with a sensitivity many modern viewers have lost. They could judge quality by touch, by weight, by drape, by how cloth responded to weather. They noticed stitching, wear, and fiber with trained attention. Clothing was not background. It was evidence. Perhaps that is why descriptions of appearance in wills, legal disputes, and household records can feel surprisingly specific. A red hood, a fur-lined gown, a blue cloak, a certain belt. These details mattered because they were economically real and socially meaningful. They were part of how a person's life could be remembered or contested. Imagine, then, standing in a crowded market street. Before anyone speaks, you already know something through dress. You see patched knees, polished boots, worn cuffs, expensive fur, careful cleanliness, faded dye, working aprons, narrow sleeves too fine for labor, cloaks that have survived too many winters, and hats chosen as much for statement as for weather. The street reads like a moving text, and everyone else is reading you the same way. That quiet mutual judgment shaped posture itself. People stood differently in good clothes. They guarded cleaner garments from contact. They walked more carefully in valuable shoes. They adjusted belts, sleeves, and veils not only for comfort but because self-presentation was constant social work. To wear clothing all day was to remain partially aware of being seen. This did not disappear indoors. At table, at prayer, in service, in labor, and in courtship, dress continued to mediate relationships. Who sat where, who served whom, who could remove a cloak comfortably and who could not, small details of cloth often mirrored larger structures of power. And nowhere was that clearer than in the spaces where appearance and intimacy collided most directly. Courtship, marriage negotiations, household service, and the strange private public world of the medieval bedchamber, where clothing, status, modesty, and vulnerability met in ways far more complicated than modern imagination usually expects. And nowhere was that clearer than in the spaces where appearance and intimacy collided most directly. Courtship, marriage negotiations, household service, and the strange private-public world of the medieval bedchamber, where clothing, status, modesty, and vulnerability met in ways far more complicated than modern imagination usually expects. The medieval bedchamber, despite the name, was not always the private sanctuary modern people tend to picture. Privacy itself was a luxury, unevenly distributed and often incomplete. In poorer households, sleeping spaces were shared, multipurpose, and deeply practical. In wealthier homes, chambers could be more controlled, but even there, servants, attendants, family members, and household routines blurred the line between private and public life. Clothing did not stop mattering at the bedroom door. In some ways, it mattered even more. Undressing, especially for women of status, could be a social act shaped by rank and custom rather than solitary privacy. Layers were removed not in cinematic silence, but often through familiar household ritual. Pins came loose, belts were unfastened, sleeves were eased free, head coverings were removed, revealing the long management of hair beneath. Shoes came off with the memory of the road still in them. A gown that had carried dignity all day became suddenly heavy, its weight more obvious once its social function was temporarily suspended. This is an important point. Clothing in the bedchamber did not simply vanish. It transformed from public statement into physical reality. A fine dress admired at dinner became a tiring burden by night. A carefully arranged veil, once a sign of propriety, became heat and pressure relieved at last. The body, which had served social expectations all day, returned to itself through gradual release. Yet even that release was shaped by modesty. Medieval people did not live in a world indifferent to bodily exposure. Christian moral expectations, local customs, family arrangements, and practical necessity all created a complicated landscape around undress. A married couple, a servant sleeping near the hearth, a child sharing family bedding, a noblewoman attended by servants, all experienced different degrees of exposure and privacy, but none lived inside the modern assumption of complete personal seclusion. This made the nightshirt or shift more than a simple garment. It offered a compromise between modesty and comfort. A linen shift allowed the body to leave behind outer dress without entering full vulnerability. It protected the skin from rougher bedding, absorbed sweat, and made sleep more physically bearable. It also preserved dignity in spaces where others might still be present. Sleepwear, where it existed, was not indulgence. It was practical civility. But even here, wealth changed the experience. Fine linen slept differently than coarse cloth. Better bedding changed how necessary certain layers remained. A noble sleeping beneath heavy curtains, furs, and layered blankets in a chamber protected from drafts experienced night differently than a laborer beneath thinner covers in a colder room. Clothing, once again, was the mediator between the body and discomfort. And discomfort did not disappear with sleep. Medieval beds themselves could be uneven companions. Mattresses varied enormously. Some were stuffed with straw, feathers, wool, or other available materials. Straw could shift, flatten, and create pressure points. Feather beds were softer but expensive and not universally admired, especially if poorly maintained. Blankets might be heavy and warm or thin and insufficient. Combined with the clothing still worn to preserve warmth, sleep could feel less like surrender into softness and more like negotiating rest within physical limits. This shaped posture and habit. People slept in caps for warmth. They slept in layers because cold floors and drafty walls made romantic notions of airy nightwear unrealistic. They shared warmth through shared beds, not always because of intimacy, but because heat was precious. Clothing at night, therefore, became part of the architecture of survival. Travel made this even more vivid. An inn offered shelter but rarely guaranteed comfort. Shared rooms, uncertain cleanliness, unfamiliar bedding, and the practical need to guard one's possessions made undressing a decision rather than a routine. A traveler might keep more clothing on simply because theft was possible or because the room itself inspired little trust. Boots placed close at hand, cloak used as blanket, purse kept near the body. Sleep and dress remained linked by vigilance. Courtship, too, existed within these material realities. Modern romance often imagines attraction as separate from practical dress, but in medieval life, clothing played a direct role in how people were seen, judged, and considered for marriage. A well-kept garment suggested household competence. Cleanliness suggested discipline. Good fabric implied resources. Appropriate modesty mattered. Clothing was not superficial decoration attached to courtship. It was evidence of family order and social suitability. A young woman's appearance, particularly in communities where reputation carried immense weight, was interpreted through these visible signals. Head coverings, aprons, belts, sleeves, and the condition of clothing all contributed to how seriousness and respectability were read. Men were judged as well through the maintenance of shoes, cloaks, and the visible reliability of presentation. A careless appearance could suggest moral carelessness. Marriage negotiations themselves often involved textiles quite literally. Dowries might include linens, clothing, bedding, or cloth reserves, because these were not decorative extras but foundational household wealth. A chest of good linen represented labor, planning, and domestic competence. To enter marriage with cloth was to enter it with practical security. This reveals another quiet truth. Medieval clothing was deeply connected to women's labor and authority. Even in societies where formal power often belonged to men, the management of household textiles could give women real influence. Spinning, weaving oversight, sewing, laundering, mending, storage, and preparation of household linens shaped everyday survival. Clothing did not simply appear ready-made from a market. It passed through domestic systems largely maintained by women. That labor was repetitive and often invisible, yet it was also central. A household with badly managed linens felt it everywhere, through discomfort, expense, embarrassment, and practical decline. Clean underlayers, repaired garments, prepared bedding, and preserved winter clothing were not luxuries. They were the quiet signs of competence. To be good at managing cloth was to be good at protecting the household itself. Service households intensified this dynamic. Servants were often judged through clothing both their own and the clothing they maintained for others. A servant in poor order reflected badly on the household. At the same time, servants frequently received cast-off garments from masters and mistresses, creating a strange intimacy of class through fabric. A noble's old gown, altered and simplified, might continue its life far below its original station. This transfer was practical, but it also carried social symbolism. Clothing descending through ranks reminded everyone that status could be seen, borrowed, but rarely fully escaped. A servant wearing altered fine cloth was still visibly a servant, yet the garment retained traces of another world. Fabric remembered hierarchy. That memory extended into legal life as well. Clothing appeared in wills, inheritance disputes, and household inventories because garments mattered enough to be named. A fur-lined cloak, a wedding gown, a certain belt, a set of linens, these could be listed specifically because they were valuable and personally meaningful. A woman might remember her mother through a garment as much as through jewelry. A family dispute might sharpen around cloth because cloth represented inheritance made visible. And because clothing carried identity so strongly, losing it could feel like more than inconvenience. Poverty was often experienced through dress long before it was explained in words. Worn shoes, thin cloaks, irreparable damage, the inability to present oneself respectably at church or market. These created social vulnerability. Medieval charity records and moral writings often understood this clearly. To clothe the poor was not only to warm them, but to restore dignity. This may be one reason why clothing appears so often in religious imagery and moral instruction. Garments symbolized humility, pride, charity, penance, transformation. The robe of a monk, the plainness of a penitent, the best garments brought out for holy days. These were understood immediately by viewers because everyone lived so physically inside the meaning of dress. Even sin could be imagined through clothing. Vanity was visible. Pride could be embroidered. Excess could be worn. Yet holiness also had texture. Rough cloth against skin, plain habits, deliberate simplicity. These were bodily disciplines, not abstract ideas. The moral life could literally rub against the body. At the other end of society, royal and noble courts pushed clothing toward spectacle. Here garments became performances of power. Rich fabrics, imported silks, elaborate sleeves, fur linings, jeweled belts, embroidery, and color choices created political theater. A ruler did not simply appear. They were staged through cloth. But this spectacle came with a physical price. Court dress could be heavy, hot, restrictive, and exhausting. Long ceremonies meant standing inside layers designed more for message than comfort. Fashionable shoes might punish the feet. Structured garments shaped posture. Wealth did not eliminate bodily inconvenience. It often translated it into socially prestigious forms. There is a useful irony here. The peasant in rough wool and the courtier in luxurious velvet were separated by wealth. But both understood that clothing asked things of the body. One endured practical discomfort for survival. The other endured ceremonial discomfort for status. The materials changed. The negotiation remained. This becomes especially vivid when illness enters the picture. To be sick while wearing ordinary medieval clothing could be deeply frustrating. Fever turned warm garments oppressive. Cold weakness made layers necessary but burdensome. Dressing and undressing required help when strength failed. Sleeves, ties, and shoes became obstacles. The body, already vulnerable, became more aware of every fastening. Pregnancy and childbirth brought similar realities. Clothing had to adapt to changing bodies, and adaptation was not always elegant. Loose gowns, supportive belts, practical layers, comfort mattered, but so did modesty and social expectation. After childbirth, linen, warmth, and household management around bedding became part of recovery. Clothing again reveals how the intimate body and the public social world were never fully separate. Even old age altered the meaning of garments. Heavy cloaks grew heavier. Cold felt sharper. Fine motor tasks like tying and fastening became slower. A warm hood might become essential rather than optional. What had once been minor inconvenience could become daily challenge. Clothing aged with the wearer and sometimes outlasted them. This continuity through life, from childhood to courtship, marriage, labor, illness, age, and death, helps explain why medieval clothing carried emotional force beyond fashion. People were born into systems of cloth and often buried within them. Garments marked beginnings, transitions, respectability, grief, devotion, and memory. They were touched constantly, repaired endlessly, judged socially, and remembered personally. And death itself opened one of the final and most revealing chapters in how medieval people understood clothing, because what was worn at burial, what was preserved, and what was left behind could say as much about a life as any written record ever could, and death itself opened one of the final and most revealing chapters in how medieval people understood clothing, because what was worn at burial, what was preserved, and what was left behind could say as much about a life as any written record ever could. Death, in the medieval world, did not erase the social meaning of dress. In many ways, it intensified it. The body that had spent a lifetime being read through clothing, through work garments, feast day dress, marriage linens, widow's veils, cloaks of status, habits of devotion, was still approached through fabric in its final moments. Burial clothing, funeral preparation, and the careful handling of garments after death all reflected how closely identity and cloth remained bound together. For ordinary people, burial was often practical rather than lavish. A simple shroud of linen was common, especially where Christian customs emphasized humility before God and the equality of souls in death. The body, washed and prepared where possible, might be wrapped rather than dressed in elaborate garments. Linen here had a final intimacy. The same material that had served as underlayer, nightshirt, and household necessity now became the last layer between body and earth. But even simplicity carried meaning. A clean burial mattered. Respectful preparation mattered. The condition of the shroud, the decency of presentation, the visible seriousness of mourning. These were not minor details. They were acts of care. In a world where cloth was valuable, using good linen for burial was not casual generosity. It represented love, duty, and dignity. Among wealthier households, clothing in death could become more visibly expressive. Fine garments, specific religious habits, family-associated textiles, or chosen ceremonial dress might be involved depending on period, place, and custom. Nobles and rulers, especially, could be buried with attention to symbolic appearance because death itself had political dimensions. The body still represented office, legitimacy, and memory. A ruler dressed for burial was not merely being mourned. They were being interpreted. What should be seen? Piety, authority, dynastic continuity, humility before God? The answer shaped the cloth around them. A monarch buried in rich garments declared one kind of message. A noble choosing simpler religious attire declared another. Death did not silence status. It reorganized it. Yet just as revealing as what was buried was what was not. Most valuable clothing stayed with the living. Garments were too useful, too expensive, and too deeply part of household survival to disappear casually into graves. A widow might inherit clothing from her husband's estate. Children might receive specific linens or cloaks through wills. Servants might be remembered with a useful garment rather than money. A carefully listed gown in a legal inventory was not sentimentality alone. It was practical inheritance. This created a strange emotional continuity. The dead remained present through the clothes they left behind. A son might wear his father's winter cloak. A daughter might receive her mother's best linen chest. A servant might continue daily life in altered garments once belonging to a household mistress. These were not museum relics preserved untouched. They were working objects carrying memory forward through use. And because they were worn, not merely displayed, memory itself became tactile. Grief could live in the ordinary act of fastening a familiar belt, unfolding a known cloak, recognizing the repaired seam made years before by someone now gone. Medieval mourning often happened through repeated contact with useful things. This is one reason wills can feel unexpectedly intimate. Legal language lists garments with surprising specificity because those items mattered emotionally and economically at once. A red gown, a fur-lined mantle, a wedding chest of linen, a best cloak for Sunday use. These were not abstractions. They were pieces of a person's life still moving through the household after death. The household itself changed shape around such losses. Clothing, like furniture or tools, marked absence. An empty hook where a cloak had hung. A chest containing folded garments no longer in use. Shoes by the bed that would not be worn again. These quiet details carried grief more persistently than grand ceremony. This reminds us that medieval clothing was never simply visual. It was deeply spatial. It occupied homes, storage chests, bedsides, hooks near doors, benches by the hearth. It shaped the geography of daily life. And when someone disappeared, those material traces remained. Religious life deepened this connection further. Clothing and salvation were often linked symbolically in Christian thought. White garments could signify purity. Torn clothing might express grief or repentance. Saints were described through habits, robes, and visible simplicity. The soul itself could be imagined through metaphors of cleansing, covering, or proper spiritual dress. People understood these images immediately because clothing was so physically central to existence. To speak of moral corruption as stain, or grace as proper covering, was not poetic decoration. It was grounded in daily bodily experience. Everyone knew what it meant to wear something dirty, something protective, something honorable, or something shameful. Pilgrimage offered another fascinating version of this. A pilgrim's clothing was both symbolic and brutally practical. Certain badges, cloaks, staffs, and hats marked the traveler's religious purpose. But the road quickly turned idealism into material reality. Rain-soaked wool, dust settled into seams, shoes were thin. A holy journey was also an extended test of whether your clothing could survive distance. Here again, the body and belief met directly through fabric. The pilgrim's cloak might signal devotion, but it also smelled of weather and fatigue. Boots meant faith and blisters at the same time. Religious clothing was never free from ordinary discomfort. It simply made that discomfort part of meaning. Monastic life sharpened this truth even further. A monk's habit or a nun's dress was designed to reduce vanity and establish discipline, but the body still felt it. Rough cloth scratched. Simplicity could be cold. Repetition created familiarity, but not always softness. Religious discipline often involved accepting clothing that reminded the wearer, quite literally, of restraint. And yet habit transforms sensation. What first feels uncomfortable can become normal, even reassuring. This may be one of the most important lessons hidden inside medieval dress. Modern viewers often imagine discomfort as something people must have constantly noticed and resented. But the body adapts. The peasant in rough wool, the nun in plain habit, the merchant in carefully maintained layers, the noblewoman managing pins and veils. They did not wake every morning astonished by inconvenience. They lived inside systems that became ordinary through repetition. The scratch of wool was not always dramatic suffering. It was Tuesday. That does not make it pleasant. It makes it human. We are often tempted to divide the past into extremes, either romantic beauty or endless misery. But lived experience usually sits somewhere quieter. Medieval clothing could be frustrating without being unbearable, beautiful without being comfortable, practical without being kind to the body. This meaning came from constancy. This constancy shaped posture, gesture, and even personality. Someone raised in long layered garments moved differently from someone raised in modern stretch fabrics and climate-controlled interiors. Sitting, bending, running, kneeling, mounting a horse, carrying water, sleeping in shared rooms. All were learned through cloth. This is why reconstructed medieval clothing can feel surprising to modern wearers. The body must renegotiate itself. Suddenly, you become aware of hems when climbing stairs. You feel the difference between thin soles and pavement. You notice how much warmth a wool layer holds, how much linen changes against the skin, how belts alter posture, how a hood changes hearing and peripheral awareness. These are not costume details. They are changes in being. To wear medieval clothing all day was to inhabit a slightly different relationship with your own body. You were more aware of weather. more aware of dirt, more aware of heat rising indoors and cold leaking through walls, more aware of whether your shoes would survive the road, more aware of how others read your respectability before you ever spoke. In that sense, clothing was a form of education. It taught limits, taught care. It taught repair instead of replacement. It taught the social consequences of appearance. It taught patience, because garments required maintenance and adjustment. It taught hierarchy because cloth announced who could afford comfort and who could not. And perhaps most quietly, it taught time. A modern shirt may arrive from nowhere and vanish just as easily. A medieval garment arrived through seasons of work. It stayed through years of wear. It aged visibly, carried repairs like scars. It passed from one body to another. Time remained visible in it. This gave clothing moral weight. Waste looked different when fabric represented known labor. Carelessness toward garments could seem like carelessness toward the people whose work made them possible. To preserve clothing was not simply thrift. It was recognition. Even fashion changes moved more slowly because cloth itself resisted speed. A new style might spread through courts and towns, but adoption depended on means, geography, and the stubborn reality that people could not simply discard everything they owned. Old forms lingered beside new ones. Fashion was layered across generations, not replaced overnight. That slow pace created a visible social map. Villages, towns, courts, and monasteries each carried distinct textile rhythms. One could often read occupation and region as much as wealth from clothing. The body moved through a landscape of cloth-coded identities. And yet people still found ways to personalize it. Preferred belt, a carefully chosen brooch, a particular way of wrapping a hood, a repaired sleeve made neat instead of hidden. Human individuality always slips through structure. This is perhaps why clothing records feel so alive. They remind us that beneath institutions and broad historical categories were people making small decisions every day about warmth, dignity, effort, and appearance. Someone choosing whether to patch one more winter into a cloak. Someone saving for better shoes before marriage. Someone keeping a mother's linen chest intact because it meant continuity. Someone removing stiff formal clothing at night with the same private relief people still feel now. Across centuries, that moment remains strangely familiar. After the church bells, after the market noise, after labor in fields or workshops, after courtly ceremony or household service, there is the quiet act of loosening the day. A belt unfastened, shoes finally removed, pins set aside, wool lifted from tired shoulders, linen against cooling skin, the body returning briefly to itself. And tomorrow the same garments, or nearly the same, would be waiting again. That repetition is the true history here. Not the rare jeweled gown or the dramatic royal procession, but the ordinary fact that for most medieval people, clothing was one of the most constant companions of life. It framed work, love, illness, prayer, reputation, travel, sleep, and death. Which is why, if we want to understand medieval life honestly, we cannot stop at asking what people wore. We have to ask how long they wore it, how often they repaired it, how carefully they protected it, and what happened when that fragile system failed. When winter came too hard, when shoes finally split beyond repair, when poverty made respectability impossible, or when the simple act of staying properly clothed became one of the hardest struggles in everyday life. Or when the simple act of staying properly clothed became one of the hardest struggles in everyday life. This is where medieval clothing stops being a matter of texture and etiquette and becomes something closer to survival. A torn cloak in winter was not merely untidy. A broken shoe was not a small inconvenience. Clothing failure could change the body's relationship to weather, work, reputation, and even safety with surprising speed. In a world with fewer buffers between person and environment, garments were not a final decorative layer placed on top of life. They were part of the structure holding life together. Winter made this brutally clear. Cold in medieval Europe was not an occasional discomfort politely solved by indoor heating. For many people, cold entered the house as easily as the person did. Stone walls held chill. Wooden buildings leaked wind. Floors drew heat downward. Windows, where they existed, were often small and imperfectly sealed. Fire helped, but fire was expensive in labor and fuel, and heat concentrated around the hearth rather than spreading evenly through a room. Clothing, therefore, remained the first and most reliable form of insulation. A good cloak in winter could feel almost like security made visible. Wool trapped warmth, and layered garments gave the body a fighting chance against long nights and hard mornings. Hoods mattered, caps mattered, proper shoes mattered, dry socks or linen wrappings mattered. The person who could preserve warmth through clothing lived a materially different day from the person who could not. And because of that, poverty announced itself first through the body. Thin garments meant shivering at prayer. Worn shoes meant hesitation on frozen ground. Insufficient bedding meant sleep that never fully became rest. A person poorly dressed for winter carried visible fatigue. Hands reddened. Movement changed. Illness arrived more easily. Respectability, which society judged so quickly, became harder to maintain precisely when survival demanded all available energy. This is one of the crueler contradictions of the period. The poor were often judged morally for conditions created by material shortage. A cloak too worn, shoes too damaged, visible dirt on work clothes. These could invite assumptions about laziness or disorder, even when they were simply evidence of exhausted resources. Medieval charity and religious teaching recognized this tension in theory, urging care for the poor, but daily social judgment could be much less generous. To remain properly dressed was not always about vanity. It was often about protecting one's place in the social world. Imagine arriving at church in winter with visibly damaged clothing. You were not just cold. You were exposed to interpretation. Neighbors noticed. Employers noticed. Potential marriage prospects noticed. Clothing failure could quietly damage opportunity. That is why mending was not a side activity. It was constant maintenance against decline. Needles, thread, patches, spare cloth, old garments cut into useful repairs. These were quiet defenses against social and physical collapse. A household that could mend well-stretched dignity further. A patched sleeve done neatly preserved more than warmth. Preserved appearance. Careful repair said, "This family still governs itself." The opposite could feel like unraveling. Shoes tell this story especially well because they sit at the meeting point of body and world. Medieval roads and streets were hard on footwear. Mud, stones, animal waste, standing water, and long walking distances punished leather relentlessly. A cracked sole could mean cold water entering during winter, infection from wet feet, slower work, and visible embarrassment all at once. And unlike modern cheap replacements, new shoes required real cost. Many people delayed replacement for as long as possible. Soles were patched. Leather was softened, reshaped, reused. Old shoes might be handed down or bought secondhand. The foot adapted to discomfort because the alternative was worse. This is why surviving descriptions of shoes in records can feel surprisingly important. They were not fashion trivia. They were practical lifelines. The same logic applied to cloaks. A heavy outer cloak was expensive precisely because it solved so many problems at once. It provided warmth, weather protection, modesty, bedding during travel, and visible respectability. To lose one through theft, damage, or desperate sale could destabilize an entire season. And people did sell clothing. In times of hardship, bad harvests, illness, debt, widowhood, garments could become emergency currency. A better cloak might be pawned. Extra linen might be sold. A family could descend visibly through its disappearing wardrobe. The body became the place where economic crisis showed itself first. There is something deeply human in this. Before bank statements or formal notices, trouble appeared in worn cuffs and thinner layers. Famine years made these realities sharper still. When food failed, clothing often followed. Labor weakened, making textile production harder. Resources were redirected toward immediate survival. People sold goods they should have kept. Garments wore out without proper replacement. The body became trapped between hunger and cold, each worsening the other. Historical records from difficult periods sometimes mention clothing with startling bluntness. People lacking shoes, lacking cloaks, lacking basic linen. These details can seem small beside wars and kings, but they often describe suffering more honestly than grand political narratives. A kingdom in crisis is visible in bare feet. Even in less dramatic times, seasonal labor exposed how vulnerable clothing systems were. Harvest work, for example, was physically punishing on garments. Repeated bending, outdoor exposure, sweat, dirt, and rough movement wore clothing down quickly. A worker needed durable clothes precisely because labor destroyed them. This created a cycle in which the people who most needed strong garments were often the least able to replace them. Women's work produced its own textile strain. Laundry near heat and water, cooking over open fires, carrying fuel, handling animals, child care, spinning, and field assistance all left marks on clothing. Aprons existed partly because outer garments needed protection from the ordinary violence of domestic labor. Smoke stained cloth. Grease settled into fibers. Sparks burned holes. Clothing remembered work. This is another reason why elite images can mislead. Illuminated manuscripts and courtly paintings preserve beauty, but most medieval clothing spent its life near ash, mud, and fatigue. And still, people cared about appearance. That care was not hypocrisy. It was proof that dignity survives even inside difficulty. A carefully cleaned cap, a properly tied belt, a brushed cloak, a repaired hem. These small acts were assertions of order against a world that often resisted it. Respectability was built through maintenance, not abundance. Children learned this lesson early. A child told not to ruin good clothes was being taught economics, morality, and household discipline all at once. Clothes were not infinitely replaceable, so behavior had consequences. Running carelessly near fire, tearing fabric during rough play, muddying feast day garments. These were not minor parental annoyances. They threatened resources, and adolescence brought sharper awareness. A young person approaching adulthood understood clothing socially in a new way. Courtship, apprenticeship, service opportunities, and reputation all made appearance more consequential. A well-kept outfit for market day or church could shape how one was seen. The emotional intensity modern teenagers attach to clothing is not new. It simply operated under harsher material limits. There was also the matter of smell, which returns again and again because it mattered so much. Medieval clothing existed in close conversation with the body and with the household environment. Smoke from hearth fires, sweat from labor, dampness from weather, the presence of animals, kitchen work, and limited laundering opportunities created a world where freshness required effort rather than automation. This did not mean people were indifferent to odor. Quite the opposite. They knew it intimately. Linen shifts were valuable partly because they helped manage this relationship between body and cloth. Airing garments mattered. Herbs might be used in storage. Sunlight, when possible, became part of maintenance. Yet the goal was rarely modern sterile freshness. It was balance, keeping garments wearable, respectable, and tolerable within real conditions. This bodily honesty often disappears in romantic historical imagination. People picture rich velvet and forget the smoke. They imagine elegant gowns and forget damp hems. They think of noble halls and forget the draft under the door and the smell trapped in winter cloaks. To wear medieval clothing all day was to live in material truth. Fabric could not pretend the world was cleaner, softer, or warmer than it was. That is partly why clothing created such strong emotional reactions. Relief at removing wet shoes, gratitude for a well-lined cloak, pride in new linen, anxiety over a growing tear, embarrassment over visible poverty, comfort in a familiar hood during travel. These feelings were immediate because clothing touched the body so directly. Even theft was experienced physically. If a cloak was stolen, the loss was not abstract property. It was cold tomorrow morning. It was fear on the road. It was being seen differently at church. And because garments mattered so much, they could also be acts of generosity with unusual force. To give clothing to the poor was to give warmth, mobility, and social restoration. To leave good linen to a daughter was to leave stability. To provide servants with decent winter garments was not kindness alone. It was recognition that bodies serve differently when protected. The medieval world understood this at every level, even if justice was unevenly applied. There is a quiet historical irony here. Modern people often spend enormous energy discussing medieval crowns, swords, and castles, while the truly constant drama of daily life happened in much humbler objects. Shoes that lasted or failed, cloaks that held through winter, linen that could be washed again, sleeves that survived another season. The real emotional history of clothing lives there, not in ceremony, but in repetition. The servant rising before dawn to dress in cold cloth near a dying fire. The merchant checking whether yesterday's rain had fully dried his outer coat. The widow preserving her late husband's best cloak because replacing it would be impossible. The child inheriting shoes already shaped by another foot. The old man pulling a familiar hood tighter against the wind because winter felt sharper now than it once did. These moments are rarely painted, but they are where life was actually lived. And perhaps nowhere did this become more emotionally charged than in moments of sudden transition, when someone moved from one social condition to another. A servant becoming a wife, a widow entering mourning, a young apprentice leaving home, a merchant rising in prosperity, a family slipping into poverty. Clothing changed first, because clothing was the quickest visible proof that life itself had shifted. A new gown could announce hope. A missing cloak could announce loss. A black veil could announce grief before a single word was spoken. And a uniform of service, a pilgrim's badge, a monk's habit, or a soldier's coat could tell the world that the person inside had stepped into an entirely different kind of life. Which means that to understand medieval clothing fully, we also have to follow those turning points, those moments when garments did not just cover the body, but marked the crossing from one identity into another. Which means that to understand medieval clothing fully, we also have to follow those turning points, those moments when garments did not just cover the body, but marked the crossing from one identity into another. Few things made this clearer than marriage. Marriage in the medieval world was never only a private emotional event, even when affection was present. It was household strategy, inheritance planning, labor organization, social reputation, and public legitimacy. Clothing stood at the center of that transition because marriage changed how a person was expected to appear. A young unmarried woman, a wife, a widow, these were not only legal or emotional states. They were visible categories, and dress helped define them. A bridal outfit, especially outside the highest nobility, was often less about fantasy and more about durability and statement. The finest garment a family could reasonably provide might become part of the marriage itself because it needed to continue serving afterward. This was not a dress for a single afternoon and a set of photographs. It was often an investment in future household respectability. Good wool, good linen, proper shoes, useful outerwear. These mattered far more than theatrical beauty. And yet beauty still mattered, because weddings were public readings of family competence. Neighbors noticed the quality of cloth. Relatives noticed whether linens were prepared properly. The presentation of the bride reflected not only her personal appearance but the discipline and resources of the household behind her. A well-kept garment said something about mothers, sisters, and domestic order. Clothing became evidence that a marriage was beginning from seriousness rather than desperation. For women especially, marriage often changed headwear in ways that made status immediately visible. In many regions, the distinction between unmarried and married appearance could be marked through veils, coverings, or styles of presentation. Hair itself had moral and social meaning. Loose visible hair could suggest youth, maidenhood, or in some contexts impropriety. Covered, arranged, and managed hair signaled maturity, respectability, and social belonging. This means that putting on a married woman's covering was not a minor accessory change. It could feel like crossing into another life. The body felt that transition physically. The same person who once moved with certain freedoms now carried visible expectations through fabric every day. Head coverings, aprons, household dress, and the social reading attached to them altered how she entered markets, churches, and conversations. Clothing taught the body its new responsibilities. Men experienced visible transitions too, though often through different symbols. Better shoes, a stronger cloak, garments suited to household leadership or trade respectability. Marriage could change how a man was expected to present reliability. A husband was not only a private role, it was a public claim to steadiness. Clothes helped support that claim. Widowhood, however, may have changed clothing even more sharply. To become a widow was to enter one of the most socially complex positions in medieval life. A widow might possess unusual household authority, financial vulnerability, social suspicion, or all three at once. Dress helped navigate this unstable ground. Mourning garments, darker tones were customary, restrained presentation, and visible seriousness signaled both grief and legitimacy. A widow's clothing often had to perform contradiction. She needed dignity without vanity, stability without inviting gossip, seriousness without complete social disappearance. Her garments were read for signs of moral conduct because widowhood could bring scrutiny as much as sympathy. And once again, the body carried the burden of interpretation. The removal of certain adornments, the continued use of older garments, the management of veils and sober dress, these were not theatrical mourning performances. They were practical negotiations with a community that watched closely. To dress wrong after loss could create suspicion. To dress too richly might imply moral looseness. To dress too poorly might imply household failure. The medieval wardrobe was full of these narrow corridors. Religious life created another profound threshold. Entering a monastery or convent meant more than changing residence. It meant changing the relationship between self and clothing almost entirely. The habit was not simply a uniform. It was a discipline, a renunciation, and a daily reminder of belonging to a different order of life. To exchange personal dress for religious clothing could be emotionally severe. Rich garments, family-associated textiles, decorative choices, and worldly self-presentation gave way to regulated simplicity. The body lost certain freedoms of expression while gaining another kind of identity. The roughness or plainness of the habit was often intentional. It taught humility not as an abstract sermon, but as something felt against the skin. There is a reason religious clothing carried such symbolic power. It was impossible to ignore. Every morning, the body entered discipline again. Pilgrimage offered a different kind of transformation. Unlike monastic life, pilgrimage was often temporary, but it still changed how one was seen. The pilgrim's badge, the travel cloak, the staff, the worn shoes. These announced a person in motion between ordinary life and sacred purpose. What is fascinating is how quickly symbolic clothing became ordinary hardship. The romantic image of pilgrimage fades the moment rain begins. A pilgrim's cloak grows heavy. Boots rub blisters into the same feet carrying spiritual intention. A hat protecting against sun becomes irritating in wind. Holy travel was still travel. Clothing was where the ideal met the road. Service, too, had its own dress language. To enter another household as a servant was to place the body inside someone else's visible order. Clothing might be provided, inherited, restricted, or judged according to the household standards. A servant's neatness reflected on the employer. Personal appearance was never entirely personal. This could be both practical and intimate. Receiving cast-off garments from a mistress or master was common enough, but it created a strange relationship. Clothing that had once signaled authority now descended into service. A servant wearing altered fine cloth carried both utility and hierarchy at once. And that descent of fabric told a quiet story about power. The garment might fit differently now, be cut down, simplified, repaired, stripped of some of its original prestige, but traces remained. Cloth remembered class. Even when altered, it still whispered where it had been. Apprenticeship marked another crossing. A young person leaving home to enter craft life stepped into new clothing expectations immediately. The apprentice's body became part of professional trust. Cleanliness, suitable dress, and the visible discipline of presentation mattered because clients and masters read them as signs of reliability. This is easy to miss from a modern distance. We tend to separate skill from appearance more than many medieval societies did. But then, clothing and character were deeply entangled. A careless appearance could suggest careless workmanship. A well-kept apron or sturdy shoes implied seriousness. Dress functioned almost like a resume worn on the body. Military life intensified this again. A soldier's clothing had to survive movement, weather, danger, and public identity all at once. Armor draws attention and imagination, but most of life around military service involved more ordinary garments. Padded layers, cloaks, boots, belts, practical protection against weather and exhaustion. Armor itself, when worn, transformed the body's entire experience. Weight shifted, heat accumulated, movement changed. The romantic image of shining steel forgets the fatigue beneath it. Clothing beneath armor mattered enormously because comfort, however limited, became the difference between endurance and misery. Even outside war, uniforms of recognizable service mattered. Messengers, guards, officials, clothing helped establish authority before speech. In a world without instant identification cards, the body often had to prove its role visually. Illness could also force identity change through dress. A strong worker becoming visibly sick experienced not only bodily weakness but social alteration. Clothes hung differently, belts loosened, layers once manageable became exhausting. A person receiving care rather than giving it could feel that change every time someone else helped with dressing. Pregnancy, too, made clothing reveal transition. The changing body demanded practical adaptation, but modesty and public expectation did not disappear. Gowns had to allow room without appearing careless. Supportive belts could relieve discomfort. Layers had to be managed differently. Pregnancy made the body more visible while often increasing the pressure to remain socially composed. After childbirth, linen and warmth became almost medical concerns. Clean cloth, manageable layers, bedding that protected rather than worsened exhaustion. These were part of recovery. The household's textile strength became immediately relevant to maternal health. Old age perhaps offered the most universal transition of all. The same cloak that once felt ordinary became heavier. Fastenings grew more frustrating. Cold arrived earlier and stayed longer. Shoes needed to forgive aching feet. Warmth moved from preference to necessity. Clothing became less about appearance and more openly about endurance. Yet dignity still remained there. An elderly person preserving respectable dress despite physical difficulty was not performing vanity. They were maintaining social personhood. To remain properly dressed meant remaining fully visible in a society that often read decline quickly. And then, beyond all these ordinary crossings, there were the moments of sudden reversal. A merchant prospering enough to change the quality of his outerwear. A family ruined by debt, selling the best cloak first. A widow remarrying and shifting again into a different visible role. A young woman entering service because marriage had failed. A household struck by plague, leaving clothing folded in rooms where no one would return. These transitions were often first seen in cloth. This may be why inventories after plague years feel so haunting. Garments listed, stored, reassigned, or abandoned reveal life interrupted. Clothing survives the person long enough to tell part of the story. Shoes remain by the bed. Winter cloaks hang unworn. Fine linen waits in a chest for a marriage that will not happen. Fabric becomes evidence of unfinished plans. And plague itself changed how people thought about dress. In times of epidemic, clothing could feel dangerous. Cloth touched bodies, carried smells, held proximity. Fear altered how garments were handled, inherited, or approached. Even if medical understanding differed from modern knowledge, people understood that sickness lived close to ordinary objects. A dead person's garments were not neutral. Should they be reused, sold, given away, purified, feared? These were not merely practical questions. They carried emotional and moral weight. Clothing stood at the border between memory and danger. This is where medieval dress becomes almost philosophical. Clothes were both deeply personal and stubbornly transferable. They shaped identity, yet they passed from one body to another. They could preserve memory, but they could also outlast attachment. A wedding gown became widow's cloth. A noble robe became servant's lining. A father's cloak became a son's winter necessity. Nothing stayed still. And perhaps that is the final correction to the museum image of medieval clothing. It was not frozen costume. It was movement, through seasons, through households, through grief and ambition, through labor and inheritance, through love and loss. A garment began somewhere, but it rarely ended there. It moved through life like a second biography. Which is why, when we ask what wearing medieval clothes all day actually felt like, the answer is not only about scratchy wool or heavy cloaks. It is also about what it felt like to live inside objects that remembered your past, announced your present, and quietly predicted how others believed your future should look. It is also about what it felt like to live inside objects that remembered your past, announced your present, and quietly predicted how others believed your future should look. Because medieval clothing did not simply reflect identity, it helped create it. A person waking before dawn and reaching for the same familiar garments each morning was not making a neutral choice. The body was stepping back into a role. The apprentice tied on the clothes of discipline and expectation. The wife arranged the visible signs of household respectability. The widow adjusted sober layers that announced grief before she spoke. The merchant dressed for trust. The servant dressed for obedience and competence. Even before breakfast, society had already begun. This daily ritual mattered because repetition shapes belief. When the body performs a role long enough, the role begins to feel natural. Clothing participated in that process. It reminded people who they were supposed to be, and sometimes who they were not allowed to become. This is one reason sumptuary laws were taken seriously even when imperfectly enforced. Authorities understood that clothing was not superficial. If people dressed beyond their assigned place, the imagination of society itself could shift. A prosperous merchant dressed too much like a nobleman was not merely showing vanity. He was testing the edges of hierarchy. And medieval hierarchy depended heavily on being visible. Unlike modern bureaucratic systems with documents, certifications, and private financial records, much of social reading happened in public space. You were seen before you were known. A cloak, a fur trim, a belt, the cut of sleeves, the quality of shoes, these became evidence of legitimacy. Clothing helped answer the question, who is this person, and how should I behave toward them? That question mattered in business, marriage, religion, and law. A merchant trying to establish trust needed clothing that suggested seriousness without inviting accusations of pride. Too plain, and he risked appearing unstable or unsuccessful. Too rich, and he risked moral suspicion or resentment. Respectability often lived in careful moderation. This balancing act was exhausting precisely because it had no perfect formula. The same garment could be read differently by different eyes. One neighbor might see prudence. Another might see pretension. One priest might condemn luxury. Another might accept it as proper dignity for one's station. Medieval people lived inside these interpretations constantly. Dress was not stable truth. It was negotiation. Women often faced even sharper scrutiny because moral judgments about appearance were tied so closely to assumptions about virtue. Clothing had to protect reputation in a world eager to interpret it. Too much adornment could be read as vanity. Too little care could be read as disorder. Visible modesty was not always personal preference, it was social defense. Head coverings show this especially well. To modern eyes, a veil or carefully arranged covering may look like a small historical detail. To the medieval wearer, it could shape daily life. It signaled maturity, marital status, religious seriousness, and respectability. It also physically shaped the body's experience. Heat around the head, hair pinned and controlled, the constant awareness of arrangement. And because headwear was so visible, mistakes felt public. A slipped veil, disordered hair, careless presentation. These were not private inconveniences. They risked interpretation. Clothing required vigilance because social reputation did too. This constant visibility helps explain why mirrors, though less common and less perfect than modern ones, mattered emotionally. Self-presentation required self-monitoring. A polished metal mirror or reflective surface was not vanity alone. It was part of managing one's place in the world. Even people with limited possessions understood this. A clean collar, a properly tied belt, a brushed hood, small corrections could preserve dignity. Appearance was built in details because detail was what others read. Children learned this early, but adolescence sharpened it. A teenager becoming aware of courtship, apprenticeship, or household responsibility began to feel clothing socially rather than only physically. The same shoes were no longer just shoes. They were part of how someone looked at you in church. A feast day garment carried nervous hope. A too-worn sleeve carried embarrassment. That emotional charge is timeless. Across centuries, young people still feel the sharpness of being seen. The difference is that medieval clothing allowed less escape. There was no cheap, fast replacement, no hidden wardrobe of alternatives, no easy reinvention. You were often known through the same few garments again and again. Reputation attached itself to repetition. This made laundering and maintenance almost moral acts. To keep linen white enough, to brush outer garments, to repair damage before it became obvious. These were forms of household self-respect. They required labor, usually unseen labor, and much of that labor fell to women. Spinning, washing, mending, storing, airing. These domestic tasks protected not only cloth but family reputation. A household where clothing was badly managed could feel unstable from the outside. Visitors noticed disorder. Employers noticed neglected servants. Priests noticed carelessness at church. Potential spouses noticed whether a family seemed capable of maintaining ordinary dignity. Textile management was social architecture hidden inside daily routine. This is why linen chests appear so often in wills and dowries. A chest of good linen represented more than material comfort. It represented competence carried forward into the next generation. A daughter receiving household textiles was receiving the practical foundation of adult life. The emotional meaning of such gifts could be profound. A mother handing over linen prepared over years was not offering decoration. She was transferring continuity. Those sheets, shifts, towels, and cloths carried labor, foresight, and care. They said, "You are expected to build a stable life from this." Men's clothing carried its own inherited expectations. A father's cloak, a working belt, a pair of durable shoes, these could represent continuity of labor and household authority. A son wearing inherited garments stepped physically into family expectation. Even if the fit was imperfect, the symbolism was not. There is something quietly powerful in that. Modern inheritance often arrives on paper. Medieval inheritance often arrived on the body, and the body remembered. A cloak shaped by another man's shoulders sat differently. Shoes worn by an older sibling taught adaptation. A widow folding her husband's garments after death was handling grief in the most practical way possible. Clothing made memory unavoidable because it demanded touch. This intimacy also made shame sharper. To be unable to clothe oneself properly was not simply financial weakness. It threatened social personhood. Medieval poverty was often worn visibly. Torn garments, inadequate shoes, insufficient winter layers, repeated repairs beyond dignity. These things could isolate a person long before hunger was openly discussed. This is why charity involving clothing carried such force. Giving bread answered hunger for a day. Giving decent garments could restore movement through society. Someone with proper shoes could work. Someone with a respectable cloak could appear at church without humiliation. Someone with clean linen could re-enter ordinary dignity. The medieval world understood this even if it failed to practice justice consistently. To clothe the poor was not metaphor. It was structural mercy. There is also a harder side to this story. Clothing could be used deliberately to humiliate. Punishments involving public exposure, enforced dress, or visible stripping of status worked precisely because garments were tied to identity. To remove someone's belt, cut their hair, force distinctive dress, or strip respectable clothing away was to attack the social self, not just the physical body. Dishonor could be worn. Likewise, authority could be staged through cloth. Judges, clergy, nobles, and officials used garments to make power legible. A robe, a fur trim, a ceremonial mantle. These did not create authority from nothing, but they made it immediately visible. The body inside the garment became harder to ignore. This theatrical side of dress reached its peak at court. Royal clothing was not merely luxurious taste. It was political communication. Silk, imported dyes, expensive fur, embroidery, jewels. These told subjects and rivals that wealth, order, and legitimacy were concentrated in one place. Ceremony required the ruler to be seen correctly, and yet beneath all that spectacle remained the same body. Heavy robes still pulled at the shoulders. Rich fabrics still trapped heat. Shoes still punished the feet during long formal appearances. A crown might elevate symbolism, but it did not erase physical discomfort. This is one of the great equalizers hidden inside clothing history. The peasant and the king both knew what it meant to want relief at the end of the day. Different garments, different stakes, same human body. At night, after ceremony or labor, the gestures were strangely universal. Shoes removed, layers loosened, belts unfastened, the shoulders dropping slightly as weight disappeared. clothing returning from public statement to private object. This daily descent from presentation into relief may be one of the most human continuities across history. And yet, even relief had boundaries. For many people, especially the poor, night did not fully free the body from clothing's demands. Cold rooms required layers to remain. Shared sleeping spaces required modesty. Tomorrow's work required preserving garments carefully for morning. Sleep itself remained inside the logic of cloth. The body never quite escaped. Travel made that even clearer. A traveler sleeping in an inn or roadside shelter often kept one eye on possessions because clothing was wealth. A stolen cloak could ruin a journey. Boots left carelessly could disappear. Belts held not just shape but money, tools, and survival. To sleep while guarding your clothes is a very different kind of rest. And that experience was common enough to shape habit. Cloaks doubled as blankets. Shoes stayed close. Good garments were folded with anxiety rather than leisure. Medieval clothing was security carried externally. Perhaps that is why descriptions of stripped prisoners, ruined soldiers, or displaced travelers feel so immediate in old records. The removal of proper clothing represented more than discomfort. It signaled the collapse of protection, respectability, and ordinary identity all at once. Without proper clothing, the body became exposed to weather and judgment together. This is especially visible during plague, war, and displacement. A refugee did not only lose a house. They lost the textile order of life, the chest of linen, the winter cloak, the repaired shoes, the known garments that made ordinary existence possible. Survival became visible in layers too thin for the season. And when recovery came, rebuilding often began with cloth. Not with luxury, but with the basics. Shoes, linen, cloaks, bedding, work garments. Civilization, at its most ordinary level, begins with the ability to be properly dressed for tomorrow. This is why textile work occupied so much medieval time. Spinning was not background noise to history. It was history. Thread became cloth, cloth became clothing, clothing became dignity, labor, marriage, authority, and survival. Entire social systems rested on the quiet turning of fiber into something the body could trust. And trust is the right word. People trusted familiar garments. They knew how a certain cloak handled rain, how certain shoes behaved on winter roads, how old linen softened after years of washing. Comfort often came less from luxury than from predictability. A garment worn for years became almost like a companion, demanding, imperfect, but known. That familiarity shaped emotion in ways modern fast consumption often does not. Losing such an item could feel like losing part of one's practical memory. The body had learned it. And so, if we stand at the edge of a medieval morning and watch someone dress, we are not watching costume. We are watching a person step back into obligation, weather, labor, and hope. Each layer means something. Each fastening is part of entering the world. The tunic is not just fabric. The shoes are not just leather. The cloak is not just warmth. They are proof that the day can be faced. And once we understand that, we can begin to see one final layer beneath everything else. The quiet psychological fact that medieval people did not merely wear their clothes. In many ways, they lived their entire lives inside them. That may sound like an obvious statement, of course people live inside their clothes, but in the medieval world, it carried a deeper truth than it often does now. Clothing was not a flexible outer layer that could be changed casually to suit mood or convenience. It was a constant environment, almost a second architecture around the body. It shaped movement, determined comfort, protected against danger, announced belonging, and reminded a person every hour of what kind of life they were living. To wake in winter and reach for cold wool was to begin the day with reality. Before words, before work, before prayer, there was the feeling of cloth against skin. Linen first if one had it, then the heavier layer, then the belt pulling shape back into the body, then shoes, sometimes forgiving, sometimes not, then the cloak if the weather demanded it. The day entered through sensation. Modern people often think of identity as something internal first and visible second. Medieval life reversed that more often than we like to admit. Identity was lived outwardly. It was practiced through posture, ritual, and dress. You became who you were supposed to be partly by wearing it correctly. A priest stepping into vestments before Mass did not simply put on special clothing. He entered authority. A widow adjusting her veil did not simply arrange fabric. She entered public grief. A laborer tying worn shoes before dawn did not simply prepare for work. He entered necessity. The body learned these truths before the mind named them. This is why changing clothes could feel emotionally powerful even when the garments themselves were plain. The transition from work clothes to feast day dress, from unmarried hair to a married woman's covering, from household garments to a pilgrim's road-worn cloak. These were moments when life itself seemed to change shape because the body changed first. And the opposite was true as well. To lose the ability to dress properly could feel like losing part of the self. Illness made this painfully clear. Someone too weak to lace their own garments, too feverish to bear heavy layers, too poor to replace what had failed. Such a person experienced vulnerability not only medically but socially. The inability to manage clothing signaled dependence. The body was no longer fully governing its place in the world. This mattered in hospitals, monasteries, and sick rooms alike. Care often began with the simplest acts. Clean linen, dry bedding, warm coverings, help with dressing. Comfort entered through cloth before cure arrived, if cure arrived at all. Even childbirth, often discussed through danger and mortality, had this textile reality beneath it. Birth required linens. Recovery required warmth. Privacy, limited as it often was, required practical arrangements of cloth and bedding. Women understood the household textile system not as domestic decoration but as bodily survival. The same was true for menstruation, though records are quieter and often indirect. Managing the ordinary realities of the female body required cloth, laundering, discretion, and labor. Medieval clothing shaped these intimate experiences constantly, even where written history prefers silence. This is another reason to resist overly clean historical narratives. Clothing was not an elegant costume placed on top of life. It was entangled with sweat, blood, childbirth, sickness, and labor. It lived very close to the body's least glamorous truths. And perhaps that closeness explains why garments could become emotionally beloved. A modern person may feel attached to a favorite coat or old sweater. Medieval people knew that feeling with sharper edges because replacement was harder and memory ran deeper. A familiar cloak carried seasons of survival. A particular hood traveled with you through years of roads, losses, and winters. Linen softened by repeated washing became not luxurious but trustworthy. Trust, again, may be the key word. People trusted certain garments because they had proven themselves. A cloak that held warmth during a terrible winter became almost part of personal history. Shoes that survived long travel were remembered. A belt worn every day became shaped not just by the waist but by routine itself. The object and the body adapted to one another. This adaptation changed posture in ways we rarely think about. Someone who always wore a belt carrying tools moved differently. Someone used to layered skirts learned balance differently. Someone in long tunics climbed stairs with unconscious knowledge. Someone in thin-soled leather shoes read the ground through the feet. The body was educated by clothing. This is why historical reenactors and textile historians often speak with surprise about movement. Put on properly made medieval garments and the body begins negotiating space differently. Sitting changes. Reaching changes. Speed changes. You become more aware of thresholds. Weather, mud, heat from fire, cold from stone. It is not only costume, it is altered consciousness. Imagine entering a cathedral in winter wearing heavy outer layers, still carrying the cold of the street. The stone building is magnificent, but also colder than comfort. You kneel in clothes that still smell faintly of smoke and wet air. The hem of your garment remembers mud from outside. The body does not stop being physical because the setting is sacred. This matters because history often isolates grand events from ordinary sensation. Kings are crowned, treaties are signed, marriages arranged, but all of it happens inside bodies wearing actual clothes. A royal council in summer heat still includes heavy sleeves and sweating under layers. A village wedding still includes shoes pinching after too many hours standing. A funeral still includes cold fingers pulling a cloak tighter. Clothing returns history to the human scale. It reminds us that power and suffering were always embodied. Take pilgrimage again. A noble and a peasant walking the same difficult road might be separated by wealth, but both would eventually think about feet. Blisters are democratic. Rain is democratic. A badly fastened cloak can ruin anyone's day. The body refuses certain illusions of rank. At the same time, wealth changed how quickly discomfort could be answered. Better shoes, spare garments, servants to manage luggage, access to inns, replacement cloaks. These mattered enormously. Class lived in the speed with which inconvenience could be solved. That may be one of the clearest definitions of privilege in the medieval world. Not the absence of discomfort, but the ability to escape it faster. A noblewoman in heavy ceremonial dress still felt heat and fatigue, but she might return to better bedding, cleaner linen, and servants to manage the garment's care. A laboring woman in rough wool felt the same body, but with fewer exits. Her discomfort stayed longer because replacement, rest, and relief were more expensive. And yet there is another complication here. People also took pride in endurance. A strong worker whose clothes showed honest labor could be respected. A pilgrim whose cloak bore the marks of distance might be admired. A widow maintaining dignity through modest, careful dress could command moral authority. Not all visible wear meant shame. Sometimes it meant legitimacy. The meaning depended on context. Mud on a feast day gown might be embarrassment. Mud on work clothes during harvest might be proof of seriousness. A patched cloak might signal poverty or prudent household management. Clothing was never only object. It was interpretation. This made self-presentation a subtle art. Medieval people were constantly adjusting the message without speaking. A better belt worn to market. Cleaner sleeves for church. Simpler dress during mourning. Stronger outer layers for travel. A servant saving the best apron for visible household duties. A merchant choosing just enough display to inspire confidence. These were not theatrical performances in the modern cynical sense. They were ordinary literacy. People read clothes because clothes genuinely communicated useful information. That reading extended across strangers. A traveler entering town was judged before speaking. A potential employer noticed shoes first. A priest observed how parishioners presented themselves at Massachusetts. A family considering marriage prospects saw cloth before character. This may sound harsh, but in a world where personal reputation traveled slowly and formal documentation was limited, visible signs carried practical weight. Clothing helped answer the ancient question, can this person be trusted? Sometimes the answer was unfair. Sometimes it was wise. Often it was both. This is why fraud through clothing could be powerful. Someone dressed above their means or station could manipulate expectation. A better cloak might open doors. A fine hood might create assumptions of credibility. Authorities worried about this precisely because appearance shaped reality. Imposture was dangerous because dress worked. The same principle explains why uniforms of office mattered so much. A messenger, official, guard, or church representative needed to be recognized quickly. Authority had to be seen before it could function. Clothing shortened social uncertainty. Even punishment understood this logic. Public shaming through altered dress, forced exposure, stripped belts, marked garments, or visible humiliation attacked identity itself. To dishonor someone through clothing was effective because clothing carried the social self. And restoration could happen the same way. A servant given proper winter clothes, a poor bride provided with good linen, a widow maintaining her dignity through sober but respectable garments, a young apprentice receiving the first truly professional outfit of adult life. These moments were not sentimental details. They were thresholds of belonging. There is a quiet tenderness in that. History is often told through battles and rulers, but ordinary people frequently experienced hope through far smaller things. A better pair of shoes, a cloak that would survive another winter, linen prepared for marriage, a child finally old enough to inherit adult garments. Hope could be folded into a chest. Fear could hang by the door in the form of a worn-out winter coat. And memory could live for decades inside the smell of old wool. If you have ever found an old jacket and remembered a whole period of your life just by touching it, then you already understand something medieval people knew instinctively. Clothing stores time differently from other objects because it keeps the shape of the body. It remembers shoulders, habits, and seasons. A chest of old garments was never just storage. It was biography. This may be why clothing so often appears in literature, sermons, legal records, and family disputes. It sat at the intersection of emotion and necessity. People argued over land, certainly, but they also argued over cloaks, linens, and inherited gowns because these were not trivial possessions. They were portable history, and portable history moved. A mother's gown became a daughter's altered dress. A father's cloak became a son's winter protection. A noblewoman's cast-off sleeve became servant's lining. Cloth traveled downward, outward, and onward, carrying fragments of former lives. Nothing in the medieval wardrobe was ever entirely finished. Even rags had futures, cleaning cloths, wrapping, bandaging, stuffing, practical afterlives that refused waste. A garment ended only when fabric itself finally surrendered. That refusal to waste tells us something important about medieval values, but also about medieval limits. When resources are hard-won, material honesty becomes unavoidable. You do not throw away what still holds warmth. And warmth, perhaps more than beauty, is the hidden center of this entire subject. Because beneath fashion, status, morality, and ceremony lies the simplest truth. People wanted not to be cold. They wanted dry feet. They wanted tolerable sleep. They wanted relief at the end of the day. They wanted clothing that allowed dignity without misery. All the symbolism sits on top of that. The grand gown and the patched tunic begin in the same place, the human body asking for protection. And if we follow that simple truth carefully enough, we begin to understand why medieval clothing could feel so heavy, not only physically but emotionally. Every garment carried weather, labor, judgment, memory, and hope at once. To put it on each morning was to accept the world as it was, and to try, with cloth and care, to move through it anyway. And nowhere was that acceptance more visible than in the marketplace itself, where cloth was bought, sold, touched, judged, and transformed from raw material into the visible fabric of medieval life. The medieval market was not only a place of exchange. It was a place of education. People learned the world through their hands there. Before a garment became part of someone's daily existence, it passed through fingers, tested for weight, softness, strength, honesty. Cloth was not trusted by appearance alone. It had to be handled. This tactile intelligence is easy to underestimate because modern shopping often happens at distance, through packaging, labels, or even screens. Medieval buyers relied far more on immediate judgment. Was the wool tightly woven or deceptively loose? Would the linen soften with use or remain stubbornly harsh? Was the dye deep and reliable, or would it fade quickly? Did the cloth hold warmth, or only the promise of warmth? People knew how to ask these questions because they had to. A poor purchase could become months of discomfort. This made textile markets unusually serious places. A bolt of cloth was not an impulse buy. It represented future winters, future marriages, future public appearances. Families thought in seasons when they bought fabric. A choice made in spring might still be worn and remembered years later. The emotional tone of these transactions was often practical, but not cold. Buying cloth could mean preparation for marriage, recovery after loss, the first signs of prosperity, or the visible admission of hardship. A new cloak after years of patched layers was not just shopping. It was relief, and relief in the medieval world could be deeply moving. Imagine a farmer's wife touching a heavier wool for the first time after several harsh winters of inadequate warmth. Imagine a young apprentice buying sturdier shoes because work has finally begun to pay. Imagine a widow deciding whether she can afford better linen or must continue mending what should have been replaced long ago. These were ordinary decisions, but they carried the emotional weight of survival. Markets also exposed inequality with remarkable clarity. The wealthy could choose finer texture, richer color, imported cloth, better fur linings, cleaner dye work, softer linen. The poor often chose between durability and immediate affordability, knowing that cheap cloth could become expensive if it failed too quickly. There is a painful mathematics in poverty. Buying the worst thing because the better thing costs too much now, even though it would protect longer. Medieval clothing lived inside that mathematics. This is why second-hand markets mattered so much. Used garments and older cloth circulated constantly because new fabric was not always possible. A good second-hand cloak might be wiser than a poor new one. Old gowns could be recut. Linens could be reworked. A garment with history was often preferable to cheap uncertainty. There is something almost modern in that instinct, but also something lost. Medieval people expected objects to have previous lives. Ownership was rarely the beginning of a garment's story. The market therefore became a place where biography could be purchased. A sleeve altered 3 times, a belt softened by another body, shoes shaped by someone else's step. These objects arrived with invisible pasts. Buyers understood this and often preferred proven material over novelty. Trust mattered more than freshness. Guilds and regulations emerged partly from this need for trust. Cloth quality was important enough to require oversight. Weavers, dyers, fullers, tailors, and shoemakers did not simply produce goods. They participated in a moral economy of reliability. Fraudulent cloth was not a harmless trick. It threatened warmth, respectability, and household stability. Bad dye that bled or faded could embarrass a family. Weak stitching could mean public failure. Poor leather could mean illness from wet winter feet. The body paid for dishonesty. This helps explain why tailors occupied such an interesting social position. They worked at the meeting point of material and identity. A tailor did not simply sew cloth together. He interpreted bodies, status, ambition, and possibility. A good tailor understood how a person wanted to be seen and how much reality would allow. The cut of a sleeve, the length of a gown, the fit of a tunic, these shaped both comfort and social reading. Too loose could look careless. Too tight could signal pretension or discomfort. Tailoring was diplomacy with fabric. And because clothing was so visible, mistakes were remembered. A badly cut garment could become a source of embarrassment that lasted years. A well-made one could quietly improve how a person moved through society. The tailor, in a sense, stitched reputation into cloth. Shoemakers did something equally intimate. Feet are honest. They refuse performance. A fashionable shoe that destroys the body becomes impossible to romanticize after enough walking. A good shoemaker understood terrain, weather, labor, and endurance. The difference between decent footwear and bad footwear was often the difference between a manageable life and constant pain. We sometimes forget how much medieval life involved walking. Markets, churches, fields, roads between villages, journeys for service, pilgrimage, travel for trade. Feet carried history. A shoe was not a side detail. It was infrastructure. This is why shoes appear so often in wills and theft records. They were valuable because they were freedom. Without decent shoes, the world shrank. The same was true of cloaks. If shoes governed movement, cloaks governed exposure. A reliable cloak meant weather could be endured rather than feared. It meant travel was possible, church attendance in winter remained bearable, and night journeys were survivable. It was outer dignity and practical shelter at once. A person without a proper cloak was visibly vulnerable. That vulnerability mattered socially because the marketplace was also a theater of judgment. People did not only buy there, they were seen there. Clothing was constantly being read against the setting of commerce. Did you look like someone who paid debts? Did you look trustworthy enough for credit? Did your household seem orderly enough to justify respect? Appearance could affect transactions before negotiation began. A merchant in worn but carefully maintained clothing might inspire more confidence than one in expensive but disorderly dress. Respectability was not simple luxury. It was disciplined coherence. Medieval people were often excellent judges of whether clothing suggested stewardship or recklessness. This is another place where modern stereotypes fail. The Middle Ages were not populated by people blind to presentation or incapable of subtle interpretation. They lived inside an intensely visual moral world. Clothing spoke, and everyone listened. Even color carried conversation. Certain dyes were expensive enough to signal status. Rich reds, deep blues, vivid greens, carefully maintained black. These were not just preferences. They implied labor, access, and intention. Faded color told another story. So did stains, sun bleaching, and repeated washing. Black is especially interesting because modern viewers often assume it was simple or universally available. In reality, achieving a rich, stable black could be expensive and technically difficult. A truly good black garment could signal wealth and seriousness at once. Color itself was social evidence. And then there was fur. Fur linings were warmth, certainly, but also hierarchy. The type of fur mattered. Some were practical and common. Others carried unmistakable prestige. Fur touched the skin differently than wool. It changed posture because it changed how a person felt themselves being seen. Luxury often begins as texture. But luxury was never separate from anxiety. Fine garments had to be protected. Rain became more dangerous. Fire became more frightening. Theft became more likely. A wealthy person's clothing could create comfort and tension at the same time. The body moved through risk more elegantly, perhaps, but still through risk. There is a quiet irony there. The peasant feared not having enough. The noble feared losing what announced abundance. Different pressures, same vigilance. Markets also reveal women's economic presence more clearly than simplified historical myths often allow. Women bought cloth, sold textiles, managed household linen decisions, and in some regions worked directly within textile trades. Spinning especially tied female labor to the entire clothing economy. The quiet turning of thread was one of the engines of medieval life. To spin was to participate in survival. It was repetitive, skilled, and often socially underestimated because it was ordinary. Yet without thread, there was no cloth. Without cloth, there was no clothing. Without clothing, there was exposure to cold, shame, and instability. History often celebrates the finished gown and forgets the hands that made the thread. But the thread came first. This truth shaped marriage expectations too. Competence with textile labor could affect how a young woman was judged as a future wife because clothing management was household management. Spinning, sewing, laundering, and storage were not decorative virtues. They were economic intelligence. Likewise, a household visibly failing in these areas announced deeper disorder. Wrinkled linen, damaged feast day garments, servants in poor repair, children dressed carelessly for church. These things suggested more than bad taste. They hinted at weak governance of the home. This could be unfair, but it was powerful. People often understood morality through maintenance. That phrase may explain much of medieval clothing culture. Morality through maintenance. Not abstract virtue alone, but visible evidence of care. Was the cloak repaired? Were the shoes cleaned? Was mourning dress properly observed? Did the widow maintain dignity? Did the apprentice look serious enough to trust? Clothing was ethics made visible. And because of that, change in clothing often announced change in fortune before words did. Neighbors might notice prosperity first through better wool. They might notice hardship first through a missing winter cloak. They might notice grief first through restrained dress. They might notice ambition first through a carefully chosen new hood. History moved through fabric quietly. This becomes especially haunting during plague years or war. The marketplace changes. Fine cloth remains unsold. Second-hand garments multiply. People buy for survival rather than celebration. Clothing from the dead re-enters circulation. Tailors alter mourning into necessity. Wealth changes hands in the form of linen and cloaks before it changes on paper. Fabric becomes a map of social shock. A prosperous household collapsing leaves traces in garments sold too quickly. A servant rising after inheritance appears first in better shoes. A widow surviving wisely is recognized by what she preserves. The marketplace records all of it, even when chronicles do not. And if we stand there long enough, between bolts of wool, stacks of linen, leather shoes waiting for new owners, old cloaks carrying old winters, we begin to see something larger. Clothing was one of the most democratic experiences of medieval life precisely because no one escaped it. The king needed cloth. The monk needed cloth. The laborer needed cloth. The bride, the widow, the soldier, the pilgrim, the dying, all passed through the same material truth. Everyone had to decide what could be afforded, what could be repaired, what must be preserved, and what the body could endure. That is not a small detail of history. It is daily civilization. And perhaps nowhere did that civilization become more visible than on feast days and Sundays, when ordinary work paused just enough for people to present not only who they were, but who they hoped the world believed them to be. And perhaps nowhere did that civilization become more visible than on feast days and Sundays, when ordinary work paused just enough for people to present not only who they were, but who they hoped the world believed them to be. On those mornings, clothing changed its rhythm. The same people who spent most days in practical wool, smoke-marked aprons, worn shoes, and garments shaped by labor reached for something better. Sometimes only slightly better, but enough to matter. A cleaner tunic, a better hood kept carefully for church, shoes reserved for holy days, linen brought out with special attention, a cloak brushed and folded with more care than usual. These were not luxuries in the modern sense. They were statements of dignity. To dress for Sunday was to step briefly into a version of life less ruled by mud and repetition. Church, after all, was not only a religious space. It was one of the central public stages of medieval society. People prayed there, certainly, but they were also seen there. Families noticed one another. Marriages were quietly evaluated. Reputations were reinforced. A person entered the church carrying not only faith, but visible evidence of household order. The woman with well-kept linen and properly arranged coverings. The merchant whose clothing suggested seriousness without arrogance. The laborer whose best garments were humble but carefully maintained. The widow whose restrained dress carried grief with dignity. These things were read instantly, and yet there was tenderness in it, too. Feast day clothing allowed people to feel themselves differently. A child in better clothes might stand a little straighter. A young man with polished shoes might imagine a different future. A woman wearing a gown prepared for a special occasion might feel, for a few hours, the emotional relief of being seen not only through labor, but through beauty. This is easy to dismiss as vanity from a distance. It was not vanity. It was humanity. People wanted moments when life felt larger than survival. Clothing helped create those moments. At weddings, baptisms, seasonal festivals, and holy days, garments carried hope. They allowed ordinary people to participate in ceremony, not just observe it. A carefully kept feast day outfit said, "I belong here too." And belonging mattered, because much of medieval life was hard, repetitive, and physically demanding. Small rituals of presentation became emotionally important. They marked time. They separated sacred days from working days. They reminded people that life was not only endurance, but also recognition, beauty, and public meaning. Even the poor fought to preserve this distinction. A family might live with patched daily clothing and still protect one decent outfit for church. That decision tells us something profound. Respectability and spiritual presence were worth sacrifice. To appear properly before God and community mattered enough to preserve cloth against hunger, cold, and wear. Again, morality lived in maintenance, and sometimes in refusal. Refusal to let poverty fully erase dignity. Refusal to let grief become social disappearance. Refusal to let hard labor define the whole visible self. Clothing was one of the quiet tools of that resistance. Of course, not everyone experienced feast days as comfort. For some, they sharpened inequality. To stand among wealthier neighbors while knowing your best clothing was still visibly inadequate could be painful. Comparison happened naturally. Rich cloth glowed differently. Better shoes walked differently. Fine fur, stable dye, and perfect linen announced resources without apology. The church gathered souls equally before God, but not bodies equally before one another. That contradiction was part of the emotional truth of medieval life. Yet even there, people found subtle forms of agency. Cleanliness could compete with luxury. Careful repair could compete with expense. Grace of presentation could soften the absence of wealth. A well-managed poor household could command respect through order alone. People understood this. They were not blind to class, but they were also not simplistic. A patched garment worn well said something different from neglect. A modest cloak carefully preserved could inspire more trust than careless extravagance. Clothing always carried nuance. And so, by the end of our journey, the original question, what did wearing medieval clothes all day actually feel like, has become much larger than fabric. Yes, it felt like wool against skin, sometimes rough, sometimes warm. It felt like belts tightening posture and shoes reminding the feet of every stone. It felt like veils, hoods, sleeves, aprons, cloaks, pins, laces, damp hems, winter cold, summer heat, and the private relief of removing it all at night. But it also felt like being judged, felt like being protected, felt like carrying family history on your shoulders. It felt like trying to look respectable with too little money. It felt like inheritance, grief, ambition, modesty, labor, marriage, and prayer. It felt like a body negotiating constantly with weather and society at the same time. That is the real answer. Medieval clothing was not costume. It was infrastructure for being human. It shaped how people worked, how they were trusted, how they were loved, how they were mourned, and how they endured ordinary life. A cloak was warmth, but also status. A pair of shoes was mobility, but also dignity. Linen was comfort, but also discipline. A wedding gown was beauty, but also economic strategy. A widow's veil was grief made visible. Nothing was only one thing, and perhaps that is why modern imagination so often gets the Middle Ages wrong. We look for dramatic symbols, crowns, armor, castles, and miss the deeper truth living in ordinary cloth. Most people did not experience history through royal ceremony. They experienced it through whether their shoes would survive winter, whether their children had proper Sunday clothes, whether a patched cloak could hold for one more season. That is where life was. That is where worry lived. That is where hope lived. A person standing by the hearth at dawn, pulling on yesterday's garments again, understood history through the body first, through cold, through weight, through fabric, through the knowledge that the day ahead would ask something of them. And these clothes were what stood between them and the world. There is something strangely intimate in realizing that. Across centuries, despite all our technology and distance, we still understand the feeling of relief in taking off heavy shoes. We still know the confidence of wearing something that makes us feel ready. We still keep certain old garments because they carry memory better than photographs. We still use clothing to signal seriousness, grief, celebration, belonging. The materials have changed. The instinct has not. And that may be the quietest bridge between us and them. Not kings or battles, but the simple human desire to be warm, to be decent, to be seen properly, and to feel, if only for a little while, that the world outside can be faced. So the next time medieval life is imagined as distant and theatrical, it may be worth thinking instead of a pair of worn leather shoes by a cold door, a cloak drying near the fire, linen folded carefully into a wooden chest, a mother teaching a child not to waste good cloth, a widow adjusting her veil before church, a traveler sleeping with boots close at hand. History lives there, in ordinary garments, in repeated gestures, in the quiet discipline of getting dressed and stepping back into life. And if any part of this surprised you most, whether it was the weight of the clothes, the social pressure behind them, or how much dignity could depend on a single cloak, I genuinely love to hear it in the comments. And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, subscribing is a simple way to stay with us for the next one. Until then, sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.